The bell above the door jingled, as it always did at 6:47 in the evening. Oscar Martinez looked up from the worn wood counter and smiled at the young mother, clutching her sleeping child to her breast. She selected a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a small bag of apples from the shelves. Oscar made a note of the items in his ledger without asking for payment. He knew the man would have lost his job last month. It had been 37 years since he first opened his doors to the public. Oscar had seen the same faces hanging over the wooden counter, heard the same stories about their sick children and their shabby homes. He knew which of his regulars got an extra bag of candy on Friday, and which of his elderly customers only bought 6 eggs a week because they could not afford more. Oscar had never refused anyone. He had given credit to those who had none, and he had trusted them to pay him back, one way or another. It all changed when the billionaire decided to open his discount grocery store in Brooklyn. The man bought the whole block on the other side of the street and bulldozed 3 historic buildings to erect his empire. His banner, Vance's Fresh Mart, where America saves, was unveiled last Monday and illuminated the darkening Brooklyn sky in gold letters. Oscar could not let him win. He lowered his prices, kept the store open later, and started to make home deliveries. He fought a losing battle against the giant corporation. His regular customers were lured away by the fancy lights and the 2-for-1 sales. Oscar's cash register grew emptier and emptier every day. That night, as he locked the door, Oscar sat in the dim light of the store and watched his wife, Maria, fold the unpaid bills into a neat stack. "We'll get through this," he whispered, but his voice was as shaky as his hands. Maria took his hand and held it while he looked at the ceiling. He knew deep in his bones that after 37 years of faithfully serving his community, his American dream was dying, brick by brick. He opened his old leather-bound ledger and turned the yellowed pages, noting familiar names scribbled carelessly on the paper. Some were smudged and some were faded, but they were all there. He had kept this book for 37 years, and it was the only witness to his 37 years of debt. When Oscar opened his eyes the next morning, a sign reading "For Sale" was nailed to his front door. His landlord had sold the building to Preston Vance, and Oscar had 30 days to move out. He looked at the familiar names in his ledger one last time before he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Oscar had been staring at the same page for the past hour, and he realized with growing horror that he had never seen this particular entry. The name Arthur Vance was written on the 47th page, 22 years earlier. Oscar's hands shook as he traced the lines of the old script. Arthur Vance was Preston's father, and his signature was scrawled carelessly across the page with Oscar's. There was a number next to it, and beside that another name. Oscar's eyes were widening as he read the words written underneath. "I, Arthur Vance, agree to pay back this loan in full within the next 5 years. In the case of default, the collateral property, described as Lot 12B, Brooklyn, will be transferred to Oscar Martinez." Oscar closed the ledger and tucked it behind his heart. He was not finished yet. The day the billionaire arrived, the whole neighborhood turned out to see the showdown. He arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows and 2 bodyguards at his back. Oscar was placing cans of beans on the shelves when the front door blew open. The billionaire smiled like a shark as he entered the room, his tailored business suit making a soft, rustling sound. "So this is it," he said loudly, gesturing at the small store. "The famous Martinez Grocery. I've heard so much about you, Oscar. 37 years of selling hope on credit. How noble of you." Oscar turned slowly and faced the man. He picked up a can of beans and placed it on the shelf behind him. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Vance?" The billionaire laughed and walked up to the counter. He picked up a tomato from the display and held it up to the light. "Look at this," he said, turning to the camera crew that had arrived with him. "This is rotting produce. This man sells rotten tomatoes while I feed an entire nation. Fresh food, low prices, real business." The few customers that had come in were silent as the billionaire spoke. Mrs. Patterson, his most loyal customer of 20 years, put her groceries down on the counter, and Oscar's heart turned to stone. "You know what you are, Oscar?" The billionaire turned back to him, his smile as fake as ever. "You are a relic of the past. You represent a bygone era when people were willing to settle for less. But America has moved on. It has moved on to bigger and better things. And so do I." He dropped the tomato on the counter with a wet smack. "This store will be gone in 30 days, and I will be here watching. Watching you leave. Because that's all you are fit for, Oscar. Leaving." He turned to the camera. "This is what happens when you stay in the past. This is what happens when you refuse to evolve. Tomorrow my new store opens with a grand celebration. Everyone is invited, except this old man and his rotten tomatoes." Preston exited the store laughing, his bodyguards following closely behind. The camera crew captured Oscar's stunned face for the last time as he sat in his chair. Mrs. Patterson quietly placed a $5 bill on the counter and left without another word. The store grew silent. Oscar sat down and looked at the ruined tomato on the counter. He felt old. He felt like he had aged 100 years. He looked up slowly, his eyes red but dry. He looked at the ledger in his hands and smiled. He was not finished yet. Not by a long shot. That night Oscar could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger in his hands, tracing Arthur Vance's signature with his fingertips. 22 years ago, the man had come to him, begging for $10,000 to pay his workers. Oscar had given it to him, and Arthur had signed his name to the 47th page of the ledger in payment. He had paid back half the money before dying of a sudden illness, and the other half had been forgotten. But not by Oscar. Oscar called his friend Detective Frank Morrison the next day. The man had retired from the NYPD 3 years earlier, but he still had a few contacts in the city. They met at a little diner near the courthouse. "Arthur Vance's signature," Frank said, peering at the page through his reading glasses. "That's a binding contract, Oscar. If that land deed is real, and if the man really did sign his name to it, that property belongs to you." Oscar's hands shook. "But Preston built his whole store on that land. It's worth millions." Frank chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "That's his problem, not yours. You need a good lawyer, someone who knows their way around property and contracts." That afternoon, Oscar met with a sharp-tongued lawyer named Susan Clark. She was a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for taking down corrupt corporations. She looked at the page 3 times before speaking. "This is gold," she said. "This is pure gold. But we need proof, Oscar. Do you have any other documents that prove Arthur Vance signed this page? Any bank statements or letters?" Oscar handed Susan a shoebox full of old papers. When she finished looking through them, she smiled. "We'll file an emergency injunction to freeze all work on that property tomorrow morning. We'll subpoena all of Preston Vance's company records. I'm sure we'll find something there." Word spread through the neighborhood that Oscar was taking the billionaire to court, and his customers returned to show their support. Mrs. Patterson brought him coffee, and a young man named Marcus offered to drive him to the courthouse. The whole community rallied around him, and he knew he was not as alone as he had felt those long, dark months. When Oscar arrived at the courthouse the next morning, he was dressed in his best suit. It had been bought for his daughter's wedding, and he only wore it once. He carried the leather-bound ledger with him as he stepped out of the taxi. A handful of reporters waited for him at the courthouse doors, and Oscar spotted Preston Vance's black SUV in the parking lot. The billionaire was already there, dressed in a business suit and looking supremely confident. "This is a waste of time," Preston said as he greeted the cameras. "An old man with a dusty book can't hurt me. I own this city." But when Oscar presented the page to the judge, her expression changed. She looked at the signature on the page, then at the rest of the documents, and she called for a recess. Oscar stepped out of the courtroom and saw Maria waiting for him. She took his hand in hers and gave it a reassuring squeeze. He did not know if they would win, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harrison looked up from the page. Oscar watched as her eyes narrowed, taking in the details of Arthur Vance's signature. She turned to the gallery and gave a short nod. "I have reviewed the documents in question," she said at last. "The signature of Arthur Vance has been authenticated by 3 independent experts. The loan agreement clearly states that Lot 12B in Brooklyn was offered as collateral for the debt. The debt was never fully repaid, and therefore, by the laws of New York State, Lot 12B now belongs to Oscar Martinez." Preston Vance shot up from his seat. "This is ridiculous. That land is worth $40 million. You can't just take it from me." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," said the judge. "You built your company on stolen land, Mr. Vance. You demolished 3 historic buildings on that property without my permission. I am ordering the immediate demolition of your Fresh Mart store, and I am ordering a full investigation into your company's alleged violations of the city's property laws. Your Fresh Mart store is hereby ordered to cease all operations immediately. Furthermore, I am ordering your company to pay Mr. Martinez $10 million for damages to his property and emotional distress." Preston's face was as pale as his suit. His lawyers were arguing amongst themselves as they filed their appeals, but Judge Harrison silenced them with a single glance. "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Vance. You publicly humiliated this man and his store. You mocked his 37 years of hard work and devotion to his community. Now the law has humiliated you." Oscar stood up slowly and looked at the man in the eye. "You said kindness did not build skyscrapers," he said quietly. "But honesty built this neighborhood. Trust built this community. And a simple handwritten ledger just destroyed your empire." The courtroom erupted in applause as Oscar's supporters in the gallery jumped up and down in excitement. Maria rushed to his side and gave him a big hug, and Detective Morrison gave Oscar a thumbs-up sign from the back of the courtroom. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. 2 weeks later, bulldozers arrived at the giant store on the other side of the street. Oscar watched from his own store as the great sign came crashing down. His customers were back, but not for the low prices. They had returned because he had not left them. He had not run away when things got hard. Oscar had stood his ground, and in the end it had been enough. Preston Vance declared bankruptcy 6 months later, and his empire slowly crumbled to the ground. Oscar opened his store the next day, and he hung a new sign above the door. "Honest prices. Honest people." since 1987. Every evening, Oscar still writes in his ledger, noting familiar names and scribbling down new ones. He never forgets them. He never forgets the lesson that the American dream is not about becoming a billionaire. It is about building something that lasts. It is about honesty and community, and it is about standing your ground, even when the whole world tells you to move. Oscar Martinez never destroyed a billionaire, but he did remind everyone that the truth never dies.